Epithelial tissue is one of the 4 main tissue types in the body, and the way in which the cells are arranged in epithelial tissue is they're arranged so that the cells form sheets which form boundaries around the body, whether that be internal or external. So we have epithelial tissue covering and lining our skin, so it's got a covering and lining function there. And we also have epithelial tissue lining our passageways. It's a bit of a connection from the outside to the inside. So you're talking about systems like the digestive system, whereby we eat, so it's external, and also the respiratory system, whereby we're intaking air. So the epithelial tissue will line those passageways, and it has a large number of functions, of which we'll have a look at shortly. We also have glandular epithelial tissue that's involved in secreting different substances in the body for use for different chemical reactions and such. So epithelial tissue does have a number of functions. It has a role in protection. So the example I used before being skin, the epithelial tissue on the surface of our skin does help protect us from different types of damage and abrasion. The epithelial tissue also has a function in absorption. So for example, if you eat food, you break down the food and you get these little nutrients, and we need a way to absorb those. And we use epithelial tissue in the small intestine within our digestive tract to do so. Epithelial tissue can filter substances as well. So our kidneys have epithelial tissue involved in filtering the blood and cleaning the blood, getting rid of substances. Epithelial tissue can secrete substances. So, for example, in the gut, we're going to secrete acids to help with the breakdown of food. We've also got epithelial tissue that's involved in transport within the respiratory system. In particular, we've got mucus in the respiratory system that is keeping our respiratory system healthy. And we also have epithelial tissue involved in sensory function. So we find epithelial tissue on the surface of our tongue. So what does the epithelial tissue look like? Well, the cells of epithelial tissue are really tightly packed together, very, very closely packed together. And this property of epithelial tissue makes it really good for something like skin, where we don't want the cells to be able to, you don't want much gap between them. So on the surface of the epithelial tissue, across the top, we have the apical surface. That's the top of the epithelial tissue layers. And the bottom layer is called the basal surface. So the basal surface is attached to the basement membrane, and this is essentially what it's doing, is attaching the epithelial tissue to a layer of tissue underneath. So there'll be a different tissue type. Epithelial tissue itself is avascular. This means that it lacks a blood supply. So it has to get its nutrients from the tissue underneath rather than from a blood supply running through it. And finally, epithelial tissue, one of a really good property of it is it regenerates really quickly. And this is why epithelial tissue is so good on the surface of our skin, whereby we lose cells from the top of our skin very, very regularly. And because it's epithelial tissue, we're able to replace it very easily and very quickly. So when we talk about epithelial tissue, we generally talk about these different structures or these different arrangements. And all I want you to take from this particular image here is I want you to be essentially having a look at the cell shape and how many layers there are. And this will help you later on in semester when we start referring to a tissue type such as epithelial tissue, and we call it squamous simple, and you go, oh, what is that? Well, this is where the classification comes in. So if we have simple epithelial tissue, it means we have a single layer. There's only one layer of cells. If we have stratified epithelial tissue, it means we have multiple layers of cells. So that's the numbers, and that gives us the simple and the stratified. The shape as well is classified. So if we have squamous, it's the simple shape at the very top there, the very top box. If we have columnar, that's referring to the box in the middle, and the final one down the bottom is columnar. Now what these epithelial types and tissues do is they have slightly different functions. So the squamous tissue, for example, is really good at withstanding things like abrasion, so we have a good amount of that on our skin. Whereas the columnar tissue at the bottom is quite large, and those cells are quite large, and so it's got an increase in surface area too, which is a property we want for absorption and secretion and functions like that. So that's where you'll find those types of tissues. So the classification is just to give you an idea of the shape and the number of cells, so when we talk about them, you'll know what they are. So that brings us to the final one, which is glandular epithelial tissue. So we have a number of glands within our body that secrete aqueous substances. So they're substances in an aqueous or fluid. So we have endocrine glands, and these are involved in the secretion of hormones, and we have exocrine glands, and so these are involved in the secretion of substances such as enzymes. The difference between the two is that endocrine glands secrete hormones directly into the blood, so it goes from the gland straight into the blood. Whereas an exocrine gland, that secretes its substance, so it could be, for an example, an enzyme, it secretes it via a duct. It can't do it directly. It has to go through a little passageway first. So that'd be the main difference between the two. The other difference between the two is that the endocrine glands secrete hormones and the exocrine glands secrete other substances such as enzymes. When we look at the shape of the ducts, the bottom part indicated in the red, that's the secretory portion of the gland. So if we look at the smaller ones at the top, we have our secretory portion going into a simple duct that will secrete that substance out. We also have more complicated glands whereby we have multiple secretory portions going up into a single duct to be released. So it's just a general structure of the glands, but the important points to take are endocrine glands secrete hormones, exocrine glands secrete other substances such as enzymes, and endocrine glands don't use ducts, whereas the exocrine glands do.